Okay, so one of the things that we need to do when we're working with clients who are depressed, in fact, actually, this works well with a lot of clients, is to help them develop their emotional awareness. And what we mean by this is that they turn their attention to what it is that they're feeling and that they developed a much more specific and fine-grained understanding of their emotions. One of the ways that this works really well is that it helps the client to tune into what they're feeling and to respond to it better. Also, it increases expressiveness of emotions. So there are a lot of different ways you can do this as a therapist. One of the ways to do this is by helping the client develop words or lists of feelings for words for feelings in sessions. You can do this either in session, or you could ask the client to do it as a homework exercise. Another useful exercise is to give clients a copy of the feelings wheel, which was developed by Gloria Wilcox and was in the Transactional Analysis Journal in 1982. Another thing you can do is you can give a client a copy of the mood meter diagram, which I think was developed by Yale University. It's based on neuroscience, and it's based on how the brain experiences emotion, which is in terms of valence. And what I mean by that is it positive or negative, nice or nasty, pleasant, unpleasant? But then it's also based on intensity, from low intensity through to high intensity. And we have these sort of two axes, and we can plot emotions on it. It's definitely worth looking at. Okay, so the next thing we need to pay attention to is through the client's cognitive processes. And one of the things that happens is when people are depressed is it's like their entire frame of reference, their filter on reality becomes negative. So everything looks negative. What we also see is that the client's view of themselves becomes negative, and also their memories of their experience become negative, and their expectations of the future become negative and pessimistic. So if we imagine that everything is filtered through this negative interpretation frame, then we get a better sense of how it is for the client who's depressed. Now, this poses a little bit of a challenge for us as therapists, because as therapists, it's very typical for us to empathize with the client's position, which of course we need to do. However, we also need to be prepared to help the client expand the way that they're perceiving things and move to a more balanced position, because, in everyday life, very rarely are things all bad or all good. Quite often they're a mixture of the two. Equally, the client will have a mixture of good and bad personal attributes. Their life experiences will be good and bad. So, for example, if a client is only talking about bad memories, then what we might do is we might subtly ask them about good memories as well, to try and create some balance in their narrative. Another thing that happens when people are depressed, and also when they're anxious, is that they find it very difficult to tolerate ambiguity or uncertainty. And what this means is that they will project their negative expectation into this uncertainty. So if they don't know how a situation is going to turn out, they expect it automatically that it's going to be bad. Also, if things start to go wrong, then they internalize and they believe that it's their fault, even when clearly it's nothing to do with them. In any situation, they will identify the negative information and filter out the positive information. Now, a lot of people do this. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that we pay more attention to negative information. But and a good example of where I see this a lot is with students. So if I give students feedback on their written work, and it might be full of positive comments, but one negative comment, you can guarantee it's the negative comment that they're going to focus on and obsess about constantly, and become, that's going to be their overall perception of their feedback. Okay, I'll move on. So one of the things, as I said, that, as I've already said, is that we need to do is to help the client to reframe this interpretation bias. So, and one of the ways that we can do this is help them to reinterpret an event or a situation. For example, a few weeks ago, I was working with a client who had lost their job. And what I did with them is I helped them see this as not just the loss of a job, but also the creation of a new opportunity, because this client has been wanting for quite a while to change career. They've done some training in this new career, so they have all the background that they need. They've just been too afraid to make the leap. And how I've done is help them reattribute it into from being a problem into being an opportunity. Also, another way we might see this is, for example, a client might say something like, "Oh, I saw my friend walking down the street the other day and they ignored me. It must be because they hate me and they don't like me anymore," which is a sort of very common thing that we might expect a depressed person to do. Reframing might just offers a different interpretation. So one of the ways we might do this is we might say to the client, "Well, of course, it's possible that your friend didn't see you." And at this point, I usually use self-disclosure by saying, if I'm walking down the street, I'm so in my own world that I don't notice people around me. And quite often, friends have told me that I've walked straight past them. And when they tell me this, I feel embarrassed and bad, because I didn't want them to feel like I'm ignoring them. It's just that I didn't see them. Also, they might be having a conversation with a friend and the friend doesn't respond positively to them. So I might say something like, "Well, maybe your friend has got things going on in their life that make it difficult for them to pay attention. Maybe they have worries that they're dealing with that they didn't want to burden you with." So there are ways in which we can take the essential facts of what happened, but offer new ways of interpreting them. This is a really good thing to do with clients who are depressed, because again, it tries and expands the perspective. So it's not just negative interpretation, but also a more balanced one. So one of the things that we can do to shift contaminations that clients have is to increase cognitive dissonance. And what I suggest by this is that we apply sort of constant pressure over a period of time. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to bring the client's existing belief into their attention and apply pressure on it through logic and rationality, but that we sustain it on it for long enough so that the client's brain picks up a prediction error. When there's a prediction error, then it's more, and it's been pressurized and held in the person's awareness, then they're more likely to challenge and update their thinking. So, for example, if a client believes that they don't deserve happiness, we could ask them, "So what sort of person deserves happiness and what sort of person doesn't? What sort of criteria would be used to determine whether someone deserves happiness?" So, for example, I asked a client this recently, and they said, "Well, somebody who does bad things to people, somebody who hurts other people." And I said, "What, by lying to them, by stealing from them, by hitting them, by being violent to them, by verbally abusing them?" And they went, "Yes, yes, all of these things." And I said to them, "Do you do any of these things?" And they said, "No." Okay. So if a person isn't horrible to other people, does that mean they deserve to be unhappy? And the client paused and said, "Probably not." So straight away, we can see that the contamination is start to shift. There are lots of ways you can do this. Please be creative. Another thing that's very, very common, and I think is a key feature of depression, is self-criticism. So how we can understand this in transaction analysis terms is that the client has a very heavy and strong internal critical parent that is constantly beating their child ego state. What we need to do is help the client to become aware of this. Now, this is often quite simple to do. One of the things I might say quite early on in a session in one of the early sessions with a depressed client is, "I get the sense that you're very hard on yourself and you criticize yourself a lot. Is that true?" Now, almost every single time the client will say, "Yes, probably." Sometimes they say no, and then what happens is they come back a week or two later and they say, "I was thinking about what you said and I noticed that I do criticize myself a lot." So one of the things that we need to do with this is to help the client increase their awareness of their self-critical internal dialogue between their ego states. We need to try and help them realize that what they're doing is their internal critical parent is beating their internal child. So there are a number of ways we can work with self-criticism, but one of them is to create some distance between it. Now, a very simple tool has been developed in research by a researcher called Cross, and they referred to this criticism as chatter. So what they do is they suggest that the therapist or the person, anybody who's been self-critical, shifts the language that they're using in their head, as if they were talking to another person. So putting it in the third person. So if I'm feeling really bad and I'm criticizing myself for a mistake and going, I've really messed this up, I've made a big mistake, I'm a failure, everything's going to be bad, everybody's going to be disappointed in me, then the way to change that, instead of I messed up, is, yes, Mark, you messed up. You're going to have to sort it out, but you can do it. Yes, it's going to be a mess. Yes, Mark, it's going to be a little bit of a mess. And yes, Mark, people might be disappointed, but it will be okay. Do you understand this little difference? It's subtle, but it works really, really well. In the research, it showed a dramatic reduction in the intensity of self-criticism. Another thing that we can do with self-criticism is to do two-chair work. This is very familiar to TA therapists who used to read decision work. So basically what we do is we get the client to put their self-critical critical parent on another chair, and we exchange in a two-chair dialogue with it. This is a really useful thing to do. It's interestingly, it started to be used by a lot of different types of psychotherapy now, who are almost like excited by how useful and effective this technique is. And I sit there thinking, we've been doing this in TA since the 1970s. But one of the things that is quite important to do is to try and identify what the positive intention is of the self-critical voice. Now, quite often it's about helping the person to be acceptable to other people. When we think about this, when we're children, our parents tell us off, they punish us, they correct our behavior when we behave in ways which are not very sociable or might upset other people. So if you can see that as being maybe the origin of it, of course, when our parents tell us off for doing something bad, they want us to be acceptable to the others. They want us to grow up to be a good person. So even though their punishment might be quite hard, they have a positive intention behind it. Another thing is that it might be that the person is self-critical as an attempt to motivate themselves. So once we've identified the positive intention, it's important for us as a therapist to say to maybe this critical, self-critical parent ego state, I really want to thank you because I understand that what you're trying to do is you're trying to take care of them by making them acceptable to others. I think you've got a really powerful job there. And then ask the client to thank them. Then I will say to the critical part, it's great that you wanted to do this for so long, but I think that maybe you don't need to do that anymore. I think that they have the ability to think about these things for themselves now without you criticizing them for it. Are you willing to back down? Are you willing to back down? Are you willing to stop, to not do this so often? And then we ask the client to request this. Then what we would do is we would ask the client to make a commitment that they will take on board this feedback and that they will agree that they will try to think about other people's feelings and get things done. Do you notice how I'm like seeing the two chairs in my office here and imagining the client having a negotiation with them? Okay, so another exercise that we can do is the mirror exercise, which was developed by Adrienne Lee. I would really encourage you to see if you can access a copy of it, maybe translate it and practice it if you can. It's very, very beautiful and very gentle exercise. I believe it was in the Transactional Analysis Journal. I think also it was in a book called Ego States, edited by Charlotte Sills from, I think, around 2003. Anyway, one of the things that we do in the mirror exercise is we ask the client to imagine their child ego state and have a dialogue with them. We do this I usually do this by asking the client to close their eyes and turn their attention inside and imagine their child part of themselves in front of them. And what we do is we guide the client by saying, Notice this child part of you. Notice how beautiful she is, how interested and curious she is in the world. Notice how enthusiastic she is, how she wants to learn and experience things. So we help the person develop a positive relationship with their child ego state. Then one of the things that we do is we help our client to move into offering the child something. So we might say, what did that child part of you need to hear? What did they need to learn? What did they need to understand about themselves? Tell them what they needed to hear. Now, this is something like, you're lovable, you're acceptable, you are okay as you are. And then we imagine this very loving, compassionate dialogue with them. Please go and look into it. It's a great little technique, and I'm sure I use it a lot with a lot of different clients. I use it with depressed clients. I use it with anxious clients. I use it with clients who've experienced childhood trauma. It has a lot of versatility, and I'm sure you will like it too. Okay. So another thing that we need to do is to think about interpersonal processes. And what I mean by that is that a lot of depressed clients have this feeling of low self-worth. They feel that they're inadequate as a person. And they tend to think that other people don't like them or that they have nothing to offer in their relationships. So we need to try and challenge this as much as we can by helping them see that, well, maybe that's not the case. What I often do is I often highlight for them about maybe the things that they do for other people. Another thing that people who are depressed do is they often stop socializing with friends, again, believing that they have nothing to offer or people are bored with me. The difficulty is that withdrawal and isolation makes the depression worse. We need social input from other people. Often experiences that have got themes of loss, danger, humiliation, or being trapped are very common in the histories of people with depression. Help the client articulate these narratives and do whatever work that you would normally do to help them heal them. Okay. So one of the things that I invite you to do is to develop a personal contract goal about something you will do that will contribute towards positive mental health or even positive health, generally speaking. It's fine if it's something you already do, but you want to maintain it. You need to be specific about when and how often. So I can give you a personal example of this. Obviously everybody needs to exercise. Exercise is very good for our physical and mental well-being. So I could make a contract that says that I am going to go to the gym a minimum of twice a week. I will go in the evening, and I will go even if it's raining, because it rains a lot in Manchester. And sometimes in the evening when it's raining, I don't want to go. But if I make a commitment to myself, then it means that I am more likely to do it. Also, if we negotiate this in a session with the client and then we follow up on did they fulfill their contract, then there's a sense of accountability. Now, it's a good idea to make these goals small and achievable so that there's something that requires some effort, but there's something that is well within the client's grasp, because we don't want the client to have a failure experience. When clients achieve goals, this stimulates the release of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine gives a sense of reward and of enjoyment. And interestingly, dopamine release also increases motivation. So what happens is we create a positive cycle where the client does things, they get dopamine. The dopamine means that they're more motivated, which means they're more likely to do things. Another contract that I have for myself is that I will eat fruit twice a day. So this is very easy for me to do. One of the ways I've been doing this is by putting fruit on top. I make porridge for breakfast, of course, in the winter, and I put fruit on the top of it, maybe some banana or some berries or something like this. And then in the evening, instead of eating sugary desserts, I will have fruit for my dessert, maybe with a little bit of yogurt and perhaps a tiny little bit of honey. That's always a nice thing to do. And then when I've eaten it, it's healthy and I feel good about myself and I feel better than if I'd eaten sugary desserts. So one of the things that we encourage a client to do is whenever they do something that's fulfilling their goal, that they acknowledge it in some way and that they allow themselves to feel pleased that they've done it. So this morning I had my porridge with blueberries on it. Whilst I was eating it, I thought to myself, this is one of my 2 portions of fruit a day. This is good. I'm achieving my goal. Last night when I went to the gym, even though I didn't particularly want to go and I didn't stay too long, I reminded myself, at least I've been, and that is one of my 2 a week. I'm going to go tomorrow, and that means I will have reached my target for this week. And yes, I will go tonight. So you see how the recognition that somebody's achieved something is quite useful. Some clients like to keep lists of the things that they need to do, a to-do list, we call them. The good thing, these are good things to do, but it's important that each time they tick something off their list as achieved, that they get the sense of satisfaction. They allow themselves to feel satisfied that they achieved, that they achieved one of these things. Now, another thing that we can do is to use apps on our phone to promote change. Mobile phones are fantastic things because usually clients have them with them at all times. It's almost like it's an extension to their body. And what we can do is we can use apps to set reminders or ask us to do things. Now, I must admit some sort of commercial interest in this, but one app that I would recommend to you is called Get Into Gear. You can find this on the App Store on both Android and iPhone. It's very orange, the icon for it. Now, it's only in English at the moment, but if you've got clients who can read and speak English, then I guess they will be okay with it. What it does is it asks the client to list a number of activities that they need to do each day. So, for example, for clients who are very depressed, just getting up out of bed in the morning can be very difficult. Getting up, getting dressed, attending to their self-care by having a shower and brushing their teeth and washing their hair, for example. So we might say to the client that they put a target in there is, I will get up out of bed by 9 a.m. that I will, have brushed my teeth, had a shower and done my hair by 9 a.m. or something like that, very simple things, or it might be more complex. Now, what happens is when the client puts in the app that they've achieved this, they get points. They get 10 points for each of these things. And the target is to have 70 points in a day. Now, this process, it might sound very superficial, but it's called gamification. And what we know from neuroscience research is that when people get points on apps and they start getting into a game with it, that this releases dopamine. So again, we can see that by doing this, it increases motivation. So far, we've done some very simple studies in this, and this does seem to be the case. The commercial interest, by the way, is that I'm the scientific advisor for this app. And so I do have a stake in the company. However, it's not really much of a commercial interest because the app is completely free to use. So we're giving it away, so I don't make any money from it. But please use it. We created it because we want people to use it. So I want to speak a little bit about the script system, or the racket system, as you might know it, which I think is a really powerful tool for understanding information. Now, I've stopped using the term racket for these emotions because I think it's very outdated. It relates to 1960s American language and it doesn't really fit anymore. Also, this language around authentic feelings and racket feelings, I think, is problematic because it seems to pathologize whatever the client's feeling. Now, if somebody told me that what I was experiencing was a racket, I would feel really angry with them, and I think understandably so. Nobody has the right to tell me whether my feelings are authentic or not. Now, some of the common secondary feelings or racket feelings, you might know them, in depression are shame and guilt, fear and anxiety, sadness and anger. They may be the secondary emotion, it may be the primary one. But play around with it and do some exploration to see what you can find. The other thing is to think about some of the beliefs that the client might have about themselves and beliefs about others. All of the beliefs that you see on this list were ones that I identified in my research on depression as being very common. Also, after I completed my research on depression, I asked 20 transactional analysis therapists if they could send an anonymized copy of their client's script system to me after they'd finished therapy. I collected 50 of them together, and I found that these particular script system beliefs were very, very common amongst most of the people in that sample. It wasn't a piece of scientific research, but I think it was a useful piece of clinical, sort of finding out information. Similarly, these sorts of belief systems about the world are very common when people are depressed. Now, the first two I think are quite interesting because I'm an existentialist, and to me, I believe that yes, life has no meaning. Nothing has any intrinsic meaning other than what we give it. Now, that doesn't mean that everything's meaningless as such. It just means there is no inherent meaning. We have to find meaning. The next one about the world being an unfair place. Well, yes, this is true. The world is unfair. We see vast differences in terms of equality in society. Some people are very, very rich. Some people are very, very poor. Bad things happen to good people. I'm not sure we can do much about this apart from help someone accept and adjust to these realities. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms of change in TA therapy for depression. Now, one of the things that was clear in my research was that TA therapists were working with cognitive interventions, behavioral interventions, affective interventions, and relational interventions in terms of both their relationship with the client and the client's relationship with other people. All of these are suitable areas for intervention. I don't want to say too much about that because I think you know this already. Some of the principles I would say that we need to follow in therapy for depression is wherever possible, try to keep the client in a state of moderate emotional arousal. So not so much emotion that they're overwhelmed, and not so little emotion that there's no emotion there and it's just a pure cognitive process. Try and keep them in the middle with a moderate amount of emotional stimulus. Try and wherever possible to introduce experiential aspects in the therapy so that the client gets a new experience in the here and now that contradicts their script beliefs. I'll say a little bit more about this in a while. Those depressogenic processes I've already talked about. I use perhaps a rather unfortunate military term for this, which is seek and destroy, which means every time you see a depressive process, look out for them. So whenever you see one, challenge it, because the more that we can undermine the ways in which our clients maintain their depression, the quicker they are to get better. We often try this through multiple points, so don't necessarily try it in one way. Come at it in different ways. Sustained focused attention on the client and on specific change is really helpful. And also sometimes it's about what we call laboring a point, which means going on about something for a little bit, maybe a little bit too long, to keep it in the client's attention. When we disconfirm a client's life script, that we don't just let it slide, that we kind of keep it in the client's attention and talk to them about how this challenges their life script and see if they can understand that this experience they're having now or a recent experience outside the session challenges this belief they have in themselves. And again, as I've already said, help the client to redirect their thinking, their interpretation, their mood, and so on, away from negative stimulus to positive or even neutral. So other things that we know that are useful about TA is the fact that TA creates a shared language between our clients and ourselves. Another principle that works very well is systematic experiential disconfirmation. Now, it's quite a bit of a long term, but it basically means that we find ways of creating or using experiences that the client has to disconfirm their life script. I wrote about this in a transactional analysis journal article. Again, I don't know if it's available for translation, but I hope that you might like it. We help the client to identify implicit memory that they may have had. And it's important that we stay flexible and responsive to our clients, and that we seek feedback from the clients about how they're experiencing. The very simple way that I do this in sessions is at least once a session, to usually maybe about 2/3 of the way through it, I say to a client, can I just check with you, how is this going today? And I always do this thing with my hands so that they can understand that it's about the communication between us. How is this going for you today? How are you finding today's session? And check in with them. The other thing I really want you to remember is to trust your own clinical judgment. Trust your intuition. Don't follow what I'm saying as like a rigid guide. Sometimes you might need to flexibly modify it according to the client that you have and your therapeutic relationship with them. Okay, so I just want to talk very briefly about some aspects of structure therapy that I use in the short-term treatment of depression. So this basically, the things I've been saying have been shown to be effective for the treatment of depression in somewhere between 16 and 24 sessions. In my own practice, I work with clients up to 20 sessions usually. Of course, sometimes I continue beyond that, but most of my clients, it's about 20 sessions. I think if you follow this, and if you're measuring it using the Core 10, PHQ-9, and GAD-7 outcome measures, that you can expect to see some improvement by session 4. I think if there's no improvement by session 12, then one of the things that you need to do is you need to look at your assessment again and check your diagnosis. Is it correct? Seek some supervision. Maybe change the way that you work with this client. Ask the client, is there anything that you'd like me to do more of or less of? Is there anything that you'd like me to do differently? And if none of this is working, then maybe it's just the case that you and the client are not a good match for each other, and you might want to refer them on to someone else. There is no shame in that. It's a very professional thing to do. I think it's better for clients to be referred on to a therapist who might do better than for them to stay in therapy for a long time and get no benefit from it. So some of the things that we might do in the beginning of a session is give outcome measures and check them against the previous session. I've already spoken a little bit about this. We establish contact by saying, it's good to see you. How are you feeling today? And then I might say something to the client, and how have things been for you since we last met, which creates a bridge between last session and the current one. At some point, we'll establish a contract for the session. I might suggest something if the client does any ideas. I will often ask them about homework that I gave them to do. Did they do it? And at all times, we stay attentive to providing empathy and noticing the relationship. Also, that if the client has an idea about what they want to focus on in that session, that we give that priority, I think, over our view. And then one of the things that I think is really important is when we first start working with a client, is that we use some role induction processes for this. Now, what I mean by this is that we help the client understand how therapy works and how they can get the most out of therapy. I produced a little 4-page document for this that I've used a lot of times with clients. It's been really, really useful. I give it to all clients from the very first time I meet them, and it works really well. There are the things that we need to do. We need to identify the problems. We need to set the goal. Coming back to the problem identification, one of the things that I do with clients is I ask them, how do you think you came to be in this situation? What contributed to it? And just ask them. It's quite simple. We need to establish contract goals and a little bit of contract about how we're going to work together, and so on. We need to try and support the client's motivation and maybe do some little psychoeducation things. One of the things I talk about at the bottom there is quick wins. And what I mean by this is I try to make sure that even from the very first session, that the client leaves feeling that they've got something out of the session and that something's changing for them. So I might use something like breathing techniques to help them relax or something like that. Another one that I use a lot is a self-soothing technique. I'm going to show you. So I'm just going to move my camera a little bit. So what I do is I might say to client, place one hand here and one hand here. And then just breathe for a moment. I'm going to move my camera back up. Keep your hands there. So just keep your hands there for a few moments and just notice a sense of warmth coming from your hands. It's nice, isn't it? So as you keep your hands there, just notice that you're soothing yourself. Great. So I might sit like this for a minute or two and help the client relax. This is a really, really nice way to nurture our child ego states. I often explain to clients that in the evening when I'm wanting to relax, I sometimes just sit like this for a few minutes. I tell clients to do this regularly. It's a nice thing to do before bed or even when you get in bed to relax. Try it yourself. Something like this will give the client a sense that they have something practical that they can take away from the session. Also, another good thing about using this technique is that if a client's talking about something in future and they start to get distressed, you have a very simple way of helping reduce their distress without interrupting the client. And it goes like this. So basically what you do is you do this. Show the client your palms of your hands and then put them like that. If the client doesn't immediately do it, do that again. And this time nod like this to indicate, do this. And every single time clients look and they go, oh yes. And they do this. And and what happens is that over a few minutes, their distress settles. It's a very good exercise technique to use. I encourage it. So the last thing I want to talk about is about ending therapy. So there are certain things that I think that we need to do. Obviously, we need to review the client's progress and give them strokes for the great changes that we made. We need to come up with a plan about how they're going to continue to implement changes in their life. One of the things that I do is help them to think about things that they might do if stuff goes wrong. So they have a plan B, if you like. Linked to this, I will always ask the client to come up with a list of how would they know if things were getting bad for them again? What might they notice? And then we write these things down. These are called prodromes, which means early warning symptoms. So it might be that they say, oh, my sleeping would be bad. I notice I'm feeling critical of myself. I notice that I don't want to go anywhere. Great. So we make a note of these things. And then what we do is we come up with a plan with the client about what will you do if that happens? What are the things that you're going to do to stop yourself from getting worse? Now I help them come up with a list. And one of the things I say to clients is that one thing you can add to your list is, and if things get really bad, I can call Mark. So what I mean is that they can call you so that they always have the option to come back. I think this is really important. I think it helps the client have a secure ongoing attachment. Another thing to do is to ask the client, what do you think were the most important or useful things that I did or that happened in therapy? Now, sometimes, most of the time, in fact, it's not the wonderfully insightful interpretation we made. It's not this stunning intervention that we did. Quite often, it's something very simple. Most of my clients tell me that the most important thing that happened in therapy is that there was always a cup of tea waiting for them when they arrived. Now, of course, it's not really about the tea, is it? What they're saying in this is that there was always a space where they were welcomed and where someone was going to care for them. I think that's what they mean. That's fine. That tells me that it's a nice thing to do. And of course, the last thing we need to do is to say goodbye. And that's what I'm going to do to you now, is I'm going to say goodbye to all of you. Thank you so much for your patience in waiting for this. I hope this has been useful for you. And I hope to see you again at some point in the future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.